It's been a while since I had an update, and in case anyone's wondering exactly why, well, as you can see, there have been a lot of moving parts, both figuratively and literally. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a long-awaited project update video for this 1/6 scale American M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. Since the previous video, the model's VVSS suspension has been fully assembled and fitted to the vehicle. The final drives have also been mounted at this time, and quite obviously, the entire lower hull has been painted with its base coat of olive drab. Clearly, there are a lot of stuff that went into the model to bring it up to the condition that we have here, so stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you because we're going to be going over all of that in this video. No need to diddle-daddle. Let's just jump right into it. To start this video off, we're actually going to revisit a new bit of detailing that I announced and previewed a few videos a little while back, and that is the 1/6 scale ECA 3D printed M4A3 Sherman tank rear engine hatch set. And in the other video, I mentioned that the set was used to retire an old cast resin set that was on the catalog for many years. And after having the opportunity to visit several real M4A3 Shermans, I was able to take all that information and transfer that over into making a new replacement in CAD, and of course, made available in 3D print. On the Jumbo, I have the static non-functional version, which is made out of a resin, or I should say on the one that's the sample piece is made out of resin, while on this unit here, this is actually a production sample of the functional set. So since I have it on hand, before I go ahead and box it up to the customer, I'll go ahead and actually show this set in better detail. So as I mentioned before, this set is all made from 3D print, and it is all-encompassing. And this one here is designed to be fully functional, where the piece can actually hinge open. And to do that, we have all of the hinging sections that are separately printed on, i.e. the main hinges are integrally printed to the plate. However, the actual hinges that are connected to the tank are not, and neither are the pins as well as the mounting fasteners. You can see here they are found on this little runner. You simply snip them off and assemble accordingly. As for the plate itself, it is fully detailed with all of the details integrally printed as a single unit, so no fiddling needs to be, or I should say sub-assemblies need to be done to get the plate ready to go. The only assembly you need to do is to get the hinging and the piece fitted in place. As for the plate itself, just like with the other unit, it features the correct detailing of the size and shape of the plate itself, the hinges, the strap section here, as well as also the handle. You'll notice that everything has been printed with its weld beads integrally printed on, so no other fiddling work needs to be done or sculpting work needs to be done by the builder. Just remove and install. However, all of these details are literally identical to the one that I mentioned in the previous video, and I'll compare and contrast that momentarily. However, where this one stands apart is with the interior. Because this unit here is fully functional, it also features the full interior detailing, and now we get to see what the interior detailing looks like with the piece now in hand. So first we have this internal box frame section that is present, and yes, the weld beads are integrally printed on the inside as they are on the outside. The weld beads are found on the box frame section as well as also on this plate section that we have right here. As for what this plate does, I have no idea, but I've seen this type of fitting found on several other Sherman tank engine hatch doors, be it the original M4 Sherman to the M3 Lee. This type of feature tends to be seen on these vehicles, and the M4A3 is no different. With the way the piece is designed, you basically just hinge it, or you mount it to the vehicle, and it basically just clears the section of the armor in this type of manner. Also, with the way the piece is designed, you can see that the plate section here is designed so that it looks like it is a separate part, which again is as per the real unit. Because this unit here is just stamped on a thick gauge steel and then just welded into the appropriate location. So you will have a natural seam in these sections here, and again, these are present on the component. With the camera readjusted, you see the rear portion here of the tank, and this is the version that I mentioned in the other video. This one here is the static version, and it is non-hinged, and this one here is meant to be a lower cost alternative compared to the full function version. The piece is much simpler to install because it is literally fully encompassing, where we have the hinge work as well as the fasteners integrally printed on. However, of course, it is non-functional. This is just meant if you're building the tank as an exterior model only and you really don't have any desire to have the piece be full functional. If that's you, boom, roll with this one here. However, here you get to see it compared to the full functional counterpart. Like I mentioned before, the CAD file for the components are identical. It's only on this one here, I just went with the extra step of making everything a separate part. But once everything is painted and weathered, it'll look identical from the exterior, but this one does have the hat trick to swing open to show you the interior detailing that I just referenced. Both of these units here, of course, are listed on the ECA catalog and can be found in the video description listed below. With the lower hull details careening to its endpoint, this brings us every day closer to the point where we need to mount on the suspension. And in order to mount on the suspension needs to be assembled and ready for installation at that point, which of course is a very good thing. So for the suspension on this model here, I'm going to be utilizing the 1/6 scale functional VVSS suspension set from none other than, well, ECA. So the ECA VVSS suspension has been on the catalog now since 2007 and have been in constant production ever since. There are a multitude of different configurations from early to mid to late production. There's also different variations on the different wrench slits that are found on the swing arms, and there's more information about that, on the catalog itself. These components here have been seen on this channel many times throughout the years for the various 1/6 scale Shermans that I've brought to the channel in the past, be it my M10s to my M4A3E2 the 76mm Jumbo, and even the Dragon Sherman that I built for commission a little while ago. All of those builds utilize this suspension set. Well, throughout the years that these sets have been in constant production, I went ahead and, occasionally we'll have an offcast for the component, and the offcast is not, if it has an impurity of one shape, form, or another, it is deemed unusable for sales, and it gets put into the spare bin. And those are the components that we have here on the table, which is why they're currently going through their revision and cleanup process. As I frequently mention on the channel, all cast resin components are thoroughly scrutinized, and the same is also true for the 3D printed parts, to make sure that the part that's being shipped is the best possible component that the mold can produce, and for 3D printed parts to make sure that there are no mishaps with the prints. And a lot of times, believe it or not, I get components in from manufacturer and they are, broken, or something just didn't print right for one reason or another. Regardless, for the suspension sets that we have here, these 6 clusters were again sitting around the shop for about 10 or so years. And these ones here, of course, are, offcast from the various orders that I've processed, during that time. These components had impurities or some sort of deficiency which prevented them from getting added to the set. Namely, things like air bubbles here or there, which for a customer set is verboten. However, for my own personal sets here, they're more than capable for the task at hand. So the units on this side here are basically done with their first step and are ready to progress with the continuation of the polishing, while this one here is still going through the initial stage. These 4 here were in pretty good shape overall. There was just some minor things like a small little air bubble or pinhole here or there. That was polished down and addressed. While on these 2, the imperfections were more glaring. These 2 specifically had some very large air bubbles found in these very prominent and easily seen locations. So this was definitely something that wasn't going to make the grade for the customer. Fortunately for me, it's definitely easily polished up. What I did was I plugged up the large and filled in the large pockets that were found on the casting with the use of the icing glazing putty that I referenced in the previous video. Mixed, put into the location. Once it sets, it sticks very well to the resin, and then I went ahead and just polished it down to the way you see it here. Fortunately, in these locations where the air bubbles are present, it's not a load or structure-bearing section, so the use of the different materials is definitely not going to be a problem. Also, on top of that, the model is static after all. Once the stuff is fully set on this one here, I'll be able to file it down, sand it down with some sandpaper, and then I could just touch everything up with the glazing, the red glazing putty, which will return that cool texturing that I mentioned before. So like I referenced before, these units were in production since 2007. However, in recent years, I always saw some room for improvement on them, and with the opportunity that I have right now, as well as with the technology that I have right now, I'm going to go ahead and give these components a bit of a, shall we say, a life extension program. I'm not going to straight up replace the units outright, because there's some things that the resin does absolutely perfectly, and it's definitely the strong suit of the set. However, there's some other components that, shall we say, can switch a media from the original to this newer version, which will just enhance the old school resin casting. So that's something that you will see as the video goes on. But so far, we're definitely on the road to reaching that goal. The final drives are one of the most important bits of equipment to have on your model. If it's a tracked vehicle, the final drives are extremely important, because this device here bridges the gap between the vehicle's hull and the running gear. And it doesn't matter the country of origin or the make of vehicle, if it's got tracks, the final drives are going to be required. It could be a Tiger 1, Panther, Panzer IV, M60, M48, it doesn't matter. The final drives are always an important piece of equipment, and if you're scratch building a 1/6 scale tank and you skimp on these or take a shortcut and not have them, you're really kneecapping your build. And on the Sherman family here, and the same is also extended to the M3 and even the M2, is that the final drives are very unique and they're a very cool bit of detailing. And I wanted to go ahead and finally, when I got a chance to making these sets, I wanted to bring all those cool details to the components that we have here. As I stated before, I always wanted to produce these sets, but I kept on shelving the idea because I didn't really need to make these for a long period of time. Originally, back in the early and mid-2000s, whenever I was working on a Sherman pattern vehicle, be it my first M10 or the other rotomold Shermans that I was building at the time, I would just scratch build these pieces individually as I went. The pieces were originally scratchable out of chunks of Lexan plastic, and after a few layers, it builds up to the thicknesses that we have here. As I stated before, I always wanted to produce these sets. However, I kept on shelving the need because, well, there were already other options available at the time. When I first started building Sherman pattern vehicles, starting in the early 2000s, I would basically fabricate these sections here out of chunks of Lexan plastic, where I'll build up the layers, achieving the desired thickness. On a Sherman, these are very important because they bridge the gap, and they also give the proper standoff for the sprockets on the vehicle's hull. Not to mention, you also have a lot of really cool details that are still visible, and we'll circle back to that in a second. Aside from the ones that I would originally scratch build, if I was working on an Armor Tech, they give you these in CNC aluminum, very plain, but from there I would add the cast texturing and the other details that are found on these prints over here in order to polish those up to a condition that's basically identical to these ones. But from the mid-2000s onward up until fairly recently, if I was working on a VVSS Sherman and I needed these units, I would just roll with the cast resin ones from Panzerwerk. Panzerwerk had a lot of very nice 1/6 scale cast resin detail parts back in the day, and the final drives for the Sherman were some of them. They were beautifully made, so much so that the need for me to research and develop my own set, not to mention make molds and castings, were just superfluous. There was no need to do it because his were perfect. However, sadly, about 13 years or so ago, he went ahead and decided to fold up shop forevermore, and so those products are now gone. They don't exist, and they did leave quite a hole in the hobby. And so, for the last few years, I've been essentially just picking up where he left off and just filling in the gaps that now remain. And the final drives here are definitely one of them, and I'm finally glad I'm able to get to it. The final drives, when I wanted to make them, I wanted to make them as all-encompassing as possible. This means they have all of the external detailing on the portions that are visible and for the portions that are frankly not. As for why, well,
why not?
And that's part of the charm with working in CAD. It allows you the flexibility to design the parts thoroughly, and in most cases, the realism just follows along, and also it just tends to make the model just more properly fleshed out. So for the final drives on the Sherman, they have the following format. And again, the same is true for not just the Sherman family, but also for the M3 Lee as well. So first I want to mention is with the geometry here of the bottom portion. First, the piece has this unique teardrop shape to it. and it is a flange, and it secures to the side of the final drive with a multitude of fasteners. The fasteners themselves are countersunk into the unit, so the fastener heads do not protrude too much from the base itself. In addition to that, the entire unit on the real one is cast, and because that it has a lot of rounded, swoopy edges, and the entire unit is a single casting. And on the print here, it's similar to form, although the unit is just, instead of being a single cast, it is a single 3D print. The prints themselves, before I go back into the details, are made out of FDM. Now, this is something that I don't really use much on my products. Generally, I tend to stick with SLS for the multitude, or I should say for the majority of my manufacturing. However, for components of this size, SLS tends to be a bit cost prohibitive, and also with the amount of area that's going to be visible, the SLS is not really necessarily that ideal for this application. The FDM, on the other hand, solves a lot of these problems, and I also want to say that the vendor I use who does my prints in FDM does a fantastic job, to the point where the pieces are basically perfect, and the need to make these in SLS is pretty much irrelevant. The units are very strong, and they're also pretty light, and although it's kind of laughable for a model that's this heavy, wherever you could save a little weight here or there, it doesn't really hurt much, specifically if the strength is not compromised. So back to the detailing themselves. So like I stated before, since the units are cast, there's a lot of swoopy lines, and all of this geometry is built into these parts here. On this portion, on the back end of the final drive, we have this little disc that's used as a rigidity measure, and it just adds more material to this section over here, which makes for a stronger unit. Now, I believe that not all the final drives had this little disc. Some did, some didn't, but I always did like to add them because it just adds more detailing to the final drive overall. As I mentioned before, this section here is quite visible even when the vehicle is fully completed, so having more detailing never hurts. The unit, like I said before, is all cast, and because of that, we have casting and foundry marks found in these sections, and these numbers here are lifted directly off of real examples, so the piece is again as true to form as humanly possible. Of course, the most unique thing about the Sherman family final drive is with the stem. As you can see, there's a lot of really cool geometry going on over here, and although most of this is covered up by the drive sprocket, you will see a little bit sticking out from the bottom portion. And as I mentioned before, this was one of the aspects of the Panzerwerk unit that made it very perfect for builds, was that he actually went ahead and molded these into the cast resin housing. However, he did it partially. You see, with the way the cast resin set was from Panzerwerk, you would use the final drives, and you would also use his sprockets. And his sprockets were solid resin cast. They were pretty solid in terms of structurally sound, specifically. But because of that, you weren't able to have the full stem here to support the sprocket, and you only had partial stem over here, so that his sprocket would just sit over it, and you get the illusion. However, with the way I'm going to be designing my sprockets, which is something that's going to be mentioned in an upcoming video, it's going to be true to form to the real unit, and because of that, and with the modern manufacturing techniques, I could go ahead and design the pieces accordingly to be as realistic as possible. So that's why I was able to pick up where he left off and have the full stem present with the full set of geometry. So you'll see that it has these nice deep insets over here with this built up section of material, and then most importantly, you have these large rigidity ribs that would be integrally molded on this to give strength. Obviously, this piece here would be under a lot of stress, so the more reinforcement, the better. All of these details, by the way, were lifted from real examples of these final drives, from ones that I personally took on surviving examples of Shermans that I had seen in person, to several real examples that I was able to get some very good photographs of, even with these parts being, well, listed for sale online, and without sprockets present, which definitely gave me a nice little leg up. The units, by the way, are also printed hollow, as you can see, so no drilling is required, and we have this large section over here, but this is going to be for the sprockets when they get fitted in place. And as for why I went with this design, you'll see what that looks like probably in the next video, but rest assured, this design feature is there for a reason. On the very tippy top portion, we have the top ring, and sadly this is not going to be visible once the model is completed, but again, why not? And you can see what it looks like fitted in place, and as you can see, this completes the detailing of the component immensely. The piece itself is also an FDM print, but it's a very good quality FDM print. Like I said before, this guy just likes to hit it out of the park. And this piece will just get glued into place. However, I went ahead and designed several indication points here for bits of wire to get glued in place. Same are also true for corresponding marks on this piece, so it lines up accordingly, and there's no off-center found on this part. As for why I didn't make this integrally printed on, I was actually thinking about it, but the reason why I didn't was because of the natural seam that this piece does have. If I went ahead and tried to 3D print it integrally, I think the seam would not have been as visible, or it would have been just a bit problematic to have the slight overhang that you see on these parts, and the piece would have not really came out all that great. So in order to have this, I erred on the side of caution, and I just went ahead and printed it as a separate part. But once the piece is printed, you get to see how it completes the look, and it really looks great. To secure this to the tank, we have here a bunch of little fasteners, like I stated before. These fasteners are printed in SLS because they are much stronger compared to trying to print these in resin, and FDM, it wouldn't really work out all that well. And these pieces here are just used to complete the detailing, and are also going to be used to help secure this to the tank. This is going to be held on with adhesives. I then drill out all these sections and glue these on to the side, and these two will also help give more surface area for the glues to adhere. I was thinking on trying to have some other points of contact with the hull, but I'm on the fence. Maybe I'll figure out something. But I think the fastener, or I should say the glue, along with these pegs sticking into the hull, if the holes are tight enough, I think it should be more than suffice for keeping this thing at bay. And it's quite typical, and I've done several other builds where I've done things similar. Even when I use the Panzerwerk ones, I just glue those to the sides of the hull, and they held up quite well for the 10 plus years that I've had my other builds. So I'm not predicting any problems with this one here. If anything, one thing about the FDM, super glue adheres very well to it. So as for these fasteners, as you can tell, I have a lot of them because you are going to need a lot to secure these in place. And I give you more than enough for the job at hand in case a mishap or two were to happen. But once these pieces are fitted, you get to see how complete it looks. Like I mentioned before, these internal wells over here are so that the fasteners are nice and flush. And you can see that that feature is carrying over onto the example that you see presently. If you don't want to use these and you want to use actual fasteners, you can definitely do so, which is why I left these as separate prints. And if you just want to use metal fasteners, you are more than capable of doing that as well. Jumping forward a little bit, we can see the final drives have been primed, and at this point here, they're ready for installation onto the model. If I go ahead and bring it up to the camera, you can see that the texture is absolutely smooth on these parts. And this was facilitated with both adding the cast texturing that I mentioned before. Hopefully it could come out in focus. You get to see some of that smooth cast texturing right over here. But even on the center spine here where I did not add the cast texturing, you can see that it's also fairly smooth too. And this, I believe, is a combination of the good quality of FDM that these pieces are manufactured in addition to the layer of spray paint that was just added on the surface. As for the paint, this is nothing more than El Cheapo flat black spray paint. This one here I picked up from Lowe's, and it's the cheapest stuff they have, and I have access to. And as you can see, it did a fantastic job with making the things look much more refined compared to the way we had it before. Same is also true for the one on the opposite side. I also kind of like the way how some of the letters got a little plugged up with the super glue, but again, this is true to form. The way you see these pieces on the real casted units, this is much along the lines as how they are in most cases. And it's definitely going to be a dead ringer once the piece is fully painted, weathered, and fitted to the vehicle, which is going to be something that's going to be done momentarily. With the models all spun around, you can see what the final drives look like now fitted in place. These were simply just glued onto the model with the use of super glue. However, I also had to make a slight little tweak with the hull itself. This is best illustrated with the camera off the tripod, but when I fitted the component in place, there were some substantial gaps found in these two areas. And this is something that's not uncommon, specifically when you're working on either one of these rotomolds or one of these fiberglass type vehicles. Like I stated before, when I was doing the rest of the bodywork, the hull does have some slight deformation to it, and it's something that you just have to learn how to roll with the punches on. And this is an exact circumstance of that. So the piece was glued on. If I tried to go ahead and make the piece nice and flush, the mount over here for the sprocket would have been in an angle, and that's not doing you any favors. Remember, the sprockets have to be nice and true in order for the timing to work with the track, as well as also with the wheels on the suspension. So what I did was I mounted the part, and I made sure that the center spindle here was as true as possible. Once the glue set, you could then see the gaps that were remaining, and to to eliminate the gaps, I simply just took my 2-part epoxy, the same stuff that I used to sculpt the transmission in the previous videos, and I went ahead and just mixed some and compacted it into this section over here. In addition to the epoxy, I also took some scrap sections of sheet styrene and stuffed them in there, as well as extra glue, in order to really get everything binded together. Once the glues were set, the epoxy was added, blending everything in and also giving it for a little bit of extra strength. On the real unit, there actually is a small little indentation on the casting on where the final drives do get fitted in place, so this is something that actually would be true to form to the real one. In addition to sculpting, I also went ahead and sculpted in the dividing line right over here, so that once everything is painted, you can see a clear separation between what's transmission cover and what is final drive. Same, of course, was also done to the opposite side. In addition to doing the gap removal, the other most important thing is to make sure that the two sections are mounted absolutely even with one another. It's not as important as some of the other dimensions, but you obviously do not want to have a situation where one final drive is mounted slightly back or further back compared to the other, as well as even the height. This is something that can cause complications, so you want to make sure that you measure twice and definitely glue once. To fit the component in place, I went ahead and took some measurements from the real vehicles, and I was able to compare and contrast the photographs in order to get the component lined up appropriately. Also, as further aid, I have here a Dragon sprocket, and this was perfect to use as a good illustration exactly where the sprocket's going to go. And on a Sherman, you want to pay attention to this area over here between the sprocket tooth as well as also the sponson. Obviously, once the track gets fitted in place, you don't want to have a situation where the track is riding too high and it's striking the sponson, thus getting in the way. Also, in case anyone is wondering, no, I am not using the Dragon sprockets on this tank. I'm just using it as a placeholder for the time being, just for the alignment. I will be tooling up brand new sprockets for this tank, and this is something that's going to be discussed in the next video update. So definitely stay tuned for that. The other thing to mention on the alignment, specifically on a Jumbo, is this amount of material that we have here on the front. On a regular Sherman, the final drive is actually more or less very even, if not slightly. It sticks up slightly above the portion here of the final drive. However, on a Jumbo, that's definitely not the case, as of course, as we can recall, the Jumbo, one of its attributes was the much thicker casted transmission cover. And you really get to notice that on this portion here once the final drive gets fitted in place. If you're working on a Jumbo, you want to make sure that you do have the adequate amount of material in this section over here in order to replicate the built-up armor sections. If you are working on a Jumbo, and I've seen this in far too many cases, specifically on smaller scale builds, where they take like a 1/16 Henlong to try to Jumboize it, and the one thing that they do is they up-armor the front and the side sections, replace the turret, but a lot of people forget about the transmission, and the transmission is just as important as those other armored sections. So if you're working on a Jumbo, you want to make sure that your side section resembles the one I have here, where we have an ample amount of meat from the final drive to the end portion here of the transmission blister. Back to the installation. So after the two-part epoxy was set, it was then time to complete the installation with the addition of the faux fasteners. Here you can see the fasteners fitted in place. The fasteners are the 3D printed ones that I mentioned before and are not threaded or anything. However, they do give some extra support to the part, making it grip onto the transmission in a more secure manner, as well as also giving some extra detailing. But there was some structural aspect that I wanted to incorporate, which is why, again, I rendered these as a separate printing as opposed to just having them integrally printed on the surface. So once the pieces were fitted in place with a drill bit and with the Dremel, I was able to carefully drill out all of these sections here, and then the pieces were able to slide in. The pieces are held in place with more super glue, and although they are not threaded, with the extra glue and the extra material that these things are sticking into, this does in fact offer some good structural integrity, and it does help secure this unit to the model. Matter of fact, I'll go ahead and lift the model up right now, and as you can see, I have absolutely no problems or concerns of the part possibly breaking off. With this model being static, of course, this is definitely not going to be an area of concern. In fact, like I mentioned before, in the past, I would utilize the final drives from Panzerwerk, which did have the fasteners integrally molded on, and those are simply just super glued to the front portion, and I have picked up those models from the transmission covers exclusively with basically just super glue holding them in, and it was never really an issue. So with these ones here, having separate prints with the pieces glued in place, it's definitely going to offer some more rigidity. With the camera readjusted takes us to another area I want to mention, and that's with these three fasteners over here. And you notice that they are left without the fittings added in place, and this was done strategically. One mistake that almost everybody out there makes on their Shermans, and yes, even yours truly included to a certain extent, would miss this little bit of detailing, and a true Shermanaholic will definitely be able to feel bad if they miss this, specifically once they find out. So the reason why these three are left missing at this time is because of the tin work. On the M4 Sherman tank, we all know about that fender that's in this section over here. Of course, the model is upside down, so you're going to have to just invert it to know what I'm talking about. So there would be a mud flap in this section over here, and everyone knows about the three fasteners that are on the top portion that secure it in place. There's a welded plate on the sponson, and that's where we have those three fasteners that protrude out, and it secures it to the model, or to the vehicle. Then there's also that little support strap that's welded on the inner portion of the tin work, and it lies against the transmission cover. Okay? We all know about that. However, the one aspect that everybody misses is with how does the tin work secure to the side of the transmission cover? And this is where everybody falls short. On the Sherman, the tin work is actually sandwiched between the final drive as well as also some other fastener location holes found here on the transmission cover itself. So back to the transmission cover, as we mentioned in the other video, the Shermans have this big blister found in this section over here. And with the camera readjusted, you can see that on the top portion of the blister, there are these provisions for mounting three fasteners to this angle bracket, which would be welded to the sponson. And these help secure the front transmission cover to the hull itself, in addition to the other fasteners that are on the sides and running along the top and bottom. And that's true for securing on the transmission to the tank. However, you'll notice that there are provisions for two more fasteners in this section over here of the blister. And this is for securing on the side section of the fender. The fender, of course, has this wall that protrudes from the top portion, and it just magically, if you look at the tank from the outside, it goes underneath and behind the sprocket over here, and it disappears. However, if you were ever able to look at a Sherman up close, you'll know that on this section where you have these two fasteners, there are two securing fasteners that bolt the side portion of the tin work to the fender. And if anyone's ever built an RC Sherman that has metal fenders on it that are separate, you'll know that once you bolt it onto these sections, these three portions over here, the tin work will wobble on you and flex around. For an RC tank, like on my Armor Techs, that's not something that's necessarily a problem, because you kind of want the piece to flex. If you have a large chunk of foreign material, it could potentially damage something. So having the piece flex out of the way is actually something that is kind of beneficial in some regards. However, in reality, or I should say in real life, on these real vehicles, the tin work did not move at all, and it was firmly fastened to the transmission cover, and it was first accomplished with these two holes here. In addition to these two holes, the remainder of the plate is actually sandwiched between these three fasteners found on the final drive, and this is true for all Sherman tanks, and also the M3 family as well. They would be the same exact bolts that we have here, only instead of being directly mounted into the transmission like this guy, they would be also sandwiching on the metal tin work. So on this model here, I am going to be fabricating metal tin work for this model, possibly even 3D print ones. I'm on the fence about that, but either way, I'm going to be fabricating some kind of a fender of one flavor or another. And to do that, unlike my other builds where I just have the three mounting fasteners on here, this one I'm actually going to do it the correct way, where we have all of the appropriate fasteners required to secure it in place. Furthermore, if you look at several of the other Shermans that I've filmed on this channel, real ones, those ones showing National Guard and Reserve units type modifications, some vehicles towards the end of World War II and even post-war had this extender flap found in this section right over here that was used to help extend the fender, and also will be a provision for mounting on a front mud flap. Well, on many vehicles, the front mud flap and the side skirts were never fitted. However, the extender would still be present. And that extender is also piggybacking on several of the other fasteners found on the final drive as well. It's a side little detail, a side note, but it's definitely one I want to throw out there, specifically if you're one of those Shermanaholics and you're definitely trying to squeeze as much accuracy out of your build as possible. As far as I'm concerned, I believe almost every single 1/35 scale kit out there screws this up, as well as even the 1/16s. So if you're one of those rivet counting perfectionists who love Sherman tanks, you're in good company, and if you are, you're going to feel bad because all your tanks are wrong. So just throwing that out there. And by the way, on the older kits and smaller scale kits, this is done for good reason, because it's much easier to design and manufacture the part that does not have any connection to the final drive, as opposed to actually going through the extra motions to do that. And also, a lot of people don't even know and or realize that. And once the sprocket's on and the track is on, you don't really get to see it. But it's one of those things, it is a data point, and I do want to put it out there. With the final drive secured to the model, it's time to turn back to the suspension, and here you get to see not only the VVSS housings completed, revised, and are ready for painting, but you also get to see a bunch of other stuff on the table, both new and old, in order to just assemble a full set. As I mentioned in the previous scene, the VVSS housings is something that I've had on the ECA catalog now for quite some time. And when I first designed these sets all those years ago, and the parts went into production, I was really happy on the achievement I was able to accomplish, specifically back then with the type of technology and the tooling that I had. However, I saw that it did leave some room for improvement, and I had to make some, I don't want to say shortcuts, but some design cues on those older sets in order to better accommodate the materials that I was using for manufacturing. And even after I designed those sets and they worked just fine, I always said to myself, I know I can make a better set. I know I can really take these sets and take them past what I've already done. And also this became true when I was gathering up more and more research materials on these items as time went on. And I always said to myself, one day I'm going to go ahead and revise them, but I'm going to do that once I am at a certain point where the molds start wearing out on a number of the items, and that will definitely warrant the need to go ahead and redesign, as opposed to just make new molds of current existing parts. Well, fast forward to where we're at now, and that's exactly what I've done, and also I'm going to be continuing to do on these sets. But for the time being, this is a good snapshot of where the set currently lies at the time of filming this video. So what you see on the table are a mix of original cast resin items, as well as also new items in 3D print. The only thing that are missing on the table at this time that would be needed to complete the whole set are some of the steel rods that are used to pin everything together, as well as also the wheel components. And yes, I will be talking about the wheels and assembling them in this video, and that's going to be a topic for an upcoming scene. I would love to put it all in one table, but frankly, it's just not big enough because there are that many components. So let's just go ahead and stick with the VVSS suspension at this time. So as I was mentioning before, the sets are still going to be offered on the ECA catalog, and they are going to be offered in a hybrid type format, where if we look at several of the sets on the catalog, they're either fully cast resin or they are just entirely comprised of 3D prints. Well, this one here is going to be a mixture of both. We're going to have some legacy items that are going to be cast resin, and then we also have some other newer components that are made in 3D print. And the idea is that, well, it's catering to the best of both of their strengths. There's some things that cast resin does very well, and there are also some things that 3D print does extremely well as in addition. So I almost had a little hiccup over there. Back to the swing arms, or I should say back to the housings. The housings are the biggest components found on the sets, and these will continue to be done in resin, or at least for the foreseeable future. The cast resin housings are honestly nearly perfect. I did a really good job when I designed them all those years ago. And the molds, for the most part, are still holding up quite well. At some point when the molds eventually wear out, I'll probably just extend the life and just make another mold or two of the masters that I have for the housings, because the cast resin pieces just do some things that the 3D print really doesn't do all that well. Or at least not at the time of filming this video. So the first thing that the cast resin does that the 3D print doesn't really do is cast texturing. And this is where the units really stand out. As you can see, you could get that nice cast texturing that we have on the casting themselves. And this is just something that's better indicative with old school cast resin as opposed to 3D print. However, the other major reason why I'm just going to continue using these pieces here is because, well, it frankly boils down to economics. Casting these components is more economically sound compared to trying to 3D print not one but 6 of these units, and as you can see, they are substantial in size. Something like this would definitely be cost prohibitive if I went ahead and were just to redesign the entire set in 3D print. I definitely could, it would come out beautiful, but the prices will certainly skyrocket on those items, so in order to keep the pieces competitive, the cast resin is more than suffice. Also, another reason I'm keeping these ones, believe it or not, is strength. Even though cast resin and strength are things that don't really go hand in hand, for these units here, that's not the case. With the way the load is distributed on these units here, the cast resin does a good job at being strong enough for the task at hand. Now, I'm specifically referring to a static tank. RC, that's definitely another kettle of fish, and that's not the topic of this video. Also, I've never yet tried these on an RC tank, so I have no clue or not if they'll be able to hold up to the riggers, so your guess is as good as not mine. I'm not going to give any guarantees. I'll just say a maybe. That's the best I can do, is a maybe. But anyway, for static use, though, these things are more than suffice. The other thing about the cast resin design is that how thick it is. Because of the amount of material that's on this little section over here, this makes it very robust, and it does do a good job with holding up the weight. And once assembled, these things tend to work pretty well. So it's again one of those type of situations where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Also, as I mentioned before, these ones here are repurposed off castings that I had loitering around the shop, and since the previous scene, all of the modifications have been made to the housings, and these things here are ready for assembly. Before I can get them assembled, though, I am going to have to thoroughly prime and paint everything, just because, as I often say in these videos, good luck trying to get paint and primer in these sections here once the thing is fully assembled. A Sherman is no different than any other tank, and arguably it's probably a little worse in some aspects, just because of all the clutter and stuff in here. You're just not going to be able to get paint to flow into these areas once the thing is fully built. So back to the revised components, you can see that the cast texturing has been reapplied to the surfaces, blending everything back in. It was applied to certain areas where we had some imperfections. If there are any divots or air pockets that I mentioned before, these have been thoroughly plugged up with some of the putty of one make or another, and then have been sanded nice and flush. The other thing I'll point out are the 2 caps found on the top portion of the bogie housings. These are found on the original cast resin parts. However, because of the working that was done to revise this section over here, it was easier for me to just simply drill out the original 2 details and replace them with metal fasteners. On the Sherman design, this is also true for the Stewart and even the M3 half-track with the VVSS. In order to take the unit apart, you actually have to compress the springs, because obviously there's a lot of spring pressure on these units here pushing downward, and the last thing you need to do is unfasten some bolts on a flange and boom, everything shoots out from the bottom of the vehicle. Not exactly something you want to happen. So to do that, the designers have a spring compressor. And the way this works is you undo these 2 caps over here, and then you put in a long extended like ratchet type system, and you actually turn a bolt on the inside. This bolt is connected to the springs, and it compresses the unit and alleviates the spring tension that's being emitted downward and allow you to take the thing apart without any catastrophic results. Following along? Good. So on the model over here, the original caps were deleted. I drilled out the sections, bored them out, and I just used 2 Allen cap screws over here in order to give you the detailing. Oddly enough, when I designed the Master, I used the exact same type of fasteners back then because this is basically what they look like. In addition to drilling these out, I also went ahead and drilled out the 3 sections over here for the 3 fasteners that are used to hold this bottom retention plate in place, which you can see right over here. This too is also going to be kept for the time being. If I ever redo a mold, I'll probably just integrally mold this guy in, because having this guy as a separate piece doesn't really offer any benefits, and this is something that would probably save a little time and a little bit of extra work if they were just integrally molded on, but that remains to be seen. Or that's really neither here nor there. The bottom plate section is a two-piece assembly, because trying to cast this is just easier to make it two pieces. And you can see how it fits on in place. If anyone has seen my M3 Lee VVSS video that I posted about a year ago, it's essentially the exact same design. Although that piece had a slightly different design in terms of the external details. However, the way the pieces are manufactured and assembled, I'm referring to the kit, is identical to this one here. Just gets glued in place with some super glue, and once the glues bond together, the piece becomes a single unit. And it's actually pretty strong, and some people might not think that, but it is. I have all of my Shermans, and some of them are pretty heavy, fitted on, mounted onto these sections here, and they do the job just fine. Why this is important? Well, this also gives you the detailing. It also gives you the alignment on how the piece lines up on the bottom portion of the hull, and this it ensures that all the suspension swing arms are at the appropriate height. And this is also how it secures to the tank. On the bottom portion here, we have 4 mounting fasteners, and these will be used to bolt the tank, or bolt the piece in place. On the side portion, we have some other fasteners that you can see right here. These are also going to be used, but admittedly, some of them are just faux detail pieces, because trying to get the tools in here and even the fasteners to fit in place is problematic. It's almost impossible to do. So generally, it's just held in place by the 2 on the top that we have right here and the 4 on the bottom, and the rest ones are just there for looks. But it does the job quite well. That's all there is for the original design of this piece, and this leads us to the new additions. So the first thing I want to mention is a detail accessory, and that is right over here. So on the side portion of the VVSS housings, you'll see a small little oval limber hole that is milled into this section, and the same is also true to the other side. This is the first time I've actually incorporated this detail on a 1/6 scale Sherman tank, and this is because I recently basically learned about this detail when I was studying and researching real M4 Shermans. One was the M4A3 that I filmed a little while ago, and the other one was another early production M4A3 that I filmed outside of a gun shop. And yes, I have both videos to all of those references in the video description below. Well, as I stated in those videos, every one of those Sherman housings have a small little limber hole in this section over here, which is something that makes sense, because with the way the bogey is bolted to the tank, we have 2 bogeys in these internal wells that we have right here on the top. Well, as you can see, these wells are pretty easily something that can fill up with gunk, water, mud, whatever, and that's not the type of stuff you want to have sitting in a pool, specifically on your metal surface. So the designers came up with a very simple and elegant solution: have a limber hole. So the limber hole's right over here, and that obviously alleviates all of the crap from building up. Well, if it's on the real one, I'm going to go ahead and add it to the model, so I did. This one here, this is just, I just put the piece in my mill, and I milled out the little slot that we have right there with a small router bit. You see it was done to both sides, and the same thing was also done to each of the bogey housings, giving the piece more accuracy compared to my older generation ones. Also, yes, this little oval is going to be included on the newer generation of sets that are going to be offered on the ECA catalog. And that's it for the main bogey housing, and this takes us to the other remnants of the sets that are carrying over from the Legacy Edition. The first are going to be the actual springs themselves. These are the springs, and it does both. It gives you the detailing of the Volute springs, but as you can see, they're also fully functional. If anyone's seen the other sets from my other videos in the past, you'll know that the sets are fully functional and they are fully sprung, and the way this is achieved is that we have these units that plug into these sections over here like so. And basically what the resin does, it acts as a shoe, and it just conceals the spring underneath. So once everything is built, you'll see that it gives you the detailing of the Volute spring, but it also has the full functionality of the part in question. These ones here are the original cast resin springs. The molds are a bit long in the tooth, and this is something I do want to phase out for a couple reasons. One, just casting all these parts adds to the time of the more effort to completing the sets. And the other thing is, these ones have to be meticulously machined each and every one of them. So the way they are just casted flat. I take them out, I put them in the lathe, and I just square off the back section, as well as drill and bore out the necessary material for the spring to fit in place. And this is something I have to do a lot of times. So in the future, I'm probably after this build here and I continue working on my next generation of Shermans, these guys will probably be phased out and we'll have 3D printed volute spring housings that effectively do the exact same job. But here you get to see the old school Western ones in their full glory. One other thing I want to mention about the springs is with the springs themselves. So when it comes time for these springs, I do generally use a lighter spring. And if I could find my bag over here, here we go. From the hardware store, these are generally the springs that I include in these sets here. And these, by and large, do a fantastic job for most of the applications out there for your 1/6 scale Sherman tank suspension. However, for this tank here, I went ahead and used a spring that's a bit longer. As you can see, it goes down about this far into the housing, and it's also, I think, a thicker gauge. And the reason why I went with the stiffer, stouter spring is because of the weight of this model. This model here is going to be considerably heavier compared to the other Shermans I've done in the past because of just the thick fiberglass construction, and because of that, I'm erring on the side of caution, and to do that, thicker springs are probably going to be better for supporting the weight of the heavier vehicle. Which, interestingly enough, that's a concern that the designers had on the real Jumbo because of all the extra added weight of the hull and the turret. The suspension was a bit on the strain side on that part of the vehicle, but that's just an interesting factoid. The other detail that for the time being is carrying over is also the return roller. Both the roller itself as well as the bracket itself. So here we have the brackets, and they are all strewn out here on the table. These are also repurposed units that I just had floating around the spare bin on hand. The original ones are casted flat, and then you have to sand this section over here to get rid of the pouring basin. This allows you the location to mount on the return roller. Does the job. For the most part, it was pretty good for what it was. It does have some cast texturing in these sections here, the appropriate detailing, as well as some casting numbers, as you can see. This is something that I also want to revise with a 3D printed upgrade, but this is something that is subject to be mentioned in a upcoming set. But for the time being, the old school cast resin ones are going to be used. The molds are holding up just fine, and they, again, like I said before, they do the job perfectly fine. The other thing that's also carrying over is the axle for the return roller. It is cast resin. Like I said before, these are primarily designed for static use, or just designed for static use, not primarily, they are designed for static use, and they're just to do the job. So the axle itself does have the detailing integrally molded on, and it's essentially made to be just something that you drop directly in place. For the wheel itself, here you can see the wheel, and the wheel is something that I am definitely going to upgrade with a 3D printed part. The old school cast resin ones here, the mold is shot. However, I was able to go ahead and use it one more time for this build, so this is the last hurrah for this mold. After that, that mold was already put out to pasture after the last unit was casted. So this is going to be replaced with a 3D printed counterpart. However, these ones here, because it's my build, were cleaned up with a palm sander and did a great job with making everything nice and smooth. On the face over here, we have the bushing fastener. We also have the Zerk fittings, and we also have these other two inlets over here that I believe are some kind of a plug of some sort or another. Not really sure, but if anyone's ever seen the real Sherman return rollers, this is what they look like. Same detailing on the opposite side. And as you can see, it just slides directly onto the axle, like so. And then this guy here, when the time comes, just gets glued onto the bracket, like that, and the assembly is complete. At that point there, this guy here gets mounted to the top portion of the bogie housing, and with the beauty about the Sherman design is that you could mount it on this side for one side of the vehicle, or you just mount it on this side for the other. And funny, I just realized there was another very important modification I made to the bogie housing, but again, this is something I'm going to reference when I get to the 3D printed parts, because it's applicable for that. So there's the roller bracket right there. And that is it for the old legacy parts that are carrying over. And this takes us to the new stuff. Well, the newer stuff for the next one specifically. So, a iconic bit of detailing on the Sherman suspension is the skid rail. And there were 3 patterns of skid rail during the war. The early pattern, the mid pattern, and the late pattern. This one being a later pattern vehicle, obviously we get the later pattern type skid rail. And in the past, the skid rails used to be made out of sheet metal. I used to literally cut them out, bend them to shape, drill out the holes, and supply them in the sets. And this was something that was extremely tedious and was a pain in the ass. So, when I got into 3D printing, one of the very first things I actually did, specifically when I had my own 3D printer, was I went ahead and phased out the metal skid rails and swapped them out with 3D printed counterparts. My 3D printer doesn't exist anymore. It flew across the room because I just can't set it up. But that doesn't change the fact that the files were good in. Here we can see the files of said unit printed out. So here we have the skid rails here on the table. These are done in FDM, and this was done on purpose. FDM is a perfect material for this because it's strong, and it's also much more cost effective compared to going with SLS. I could easily make the parts in SLS. If anyone prefers that, hit me up. But for this build here, and for the ones that I've sold in the recent like 2 or 3 years, they had these units. So here you can see the FDM skid rail. Skid rails themselves are a single print. They have the shape already there. They have their holes present for the use of mounting fasteners. And they have the correct geometry with the rear section having this angle cut to it, which is something that you'll see why that's relevant when they get fitted in place. The FDM is nice and smooth. It isn't bad or anything with the type of print lines. This is something, though, I am going to polish up a little bit further. I am going to do the super glue trick where I put super glue on these surfaces over here and wet sand it down so it's a nice, smooth appearance. But this is something that I'm going to be, or you're going to be noticing in the following scenes to come. And that's really all there is to mention about the skid rails. And this takes us to the new stuff. And this is something I'm very excited about because, again, I've been wanting to do it for quite some time. And what's new are all of the white components that we have here on the table, which are all made from 3D printed components. As I mentioned before, when the sets were originally designed, I always wanted to have the sets be a bit more improved, as I felt they left some room for improvement. And back then, I designed the sets in a certain way to optimize my manufacturing techniques and fabrication techniques that I had at the period, and also in a way to make them capable of being casted and being casted in a repetitive manner. And all that's important and comes to play when you're dealing with components that need to be manufactured. Also, on top of that, I did have some limitations on the reference materials that I had at that time, and since the time those pieces were produced, I've learned much more on these components, and all of these lessons were implemented in the new generation parts that we have here. And what this all entails are the components that are for holding up the springs, distributing the weight of the springs, and the swing arms themselves. All of these components now are individual printed components. In the past, the parts were actually reduced to single pieces. And to put things in perspective, here I have one of the older swing arms, castings left, just odd man out. So you can see it has the overall look and shape of the component. And if I compare that with one of these guys right over here, it's got the overall look and shape. But the inside portion here just has a generic shape of the component, while the new one has a more appropriate geometry. And what was once one single casting that needs to have been drilled out by myself, by the way, these were drilled out by me and you got them ready for pinning. Now it's a 2-piece type system, and it's ready for installation from the get-go. On the older components, these sections here had this little angle piece that was a separate component, gets glued in place, and this is actually a little track that the arms over here would slide on when the suspension would articulate. And now this here is an integral printing, and this was done because, again, trying to cast that into these sections here was a bit problematic, but with the new printing technology, I'm able to go ahead and just make the pieces a little bit easier in that regard. Also, it's better detailed with the printed on slot screw fasteners that I'll touch upon in a moment. Same was also true for the spring body. So on the original one, it was basically a giant, or it assembles into an H frame, and we have the two sections in the center here that the springs sit on, and then the suspension, or I should say the force of the springs, distributed on the arms onto the swing arms, and that's how the suspension works. Well, again, on the original units, these were a single resin casting, and on these units here, they are a multi-part. And why did I make it a multi-part? Well, frankly put, on the real one, it's a multi-part. With the way the system is designed, the spring shoe here does not pivot at all. Its job is just to go up and down, and the pivoting is done on the arms themselves. On my cast resin ones, it has the look and feel of the piece being in this type of manner. However, when the suspension would articulate, the whole unit would move in unison. And although this didn't have any problems in terms of functionality, the pieces worked just fine. This was always just something that bugged me, and I always felt, I could make it better. So I finally rewind a little bit to about a year ago when I was working on this project. I hit this point here with the suspension. I wanted to go ahead and properly do this. Again, one of the reasons is because I just wanted to improve it, and the other reason was, again, because the molds are definitely long in the tooth. And this here, by the way, is what a worn casting looks like. If it gets into focus, you can see the texture starts having this pebble, crinkle, aluminum foil type texture to it. This means the mold is past its prime and it's time for retirement. The piece can still be cleaned up, but again, it's not something that I would like to give to customers. So this here is just going to be odd man out. Maybe I'll just build up another, if I ever have enough spare parts, I can build up another spare suspension just as a why not piece. But regardless, that's not really relevant for this video. So now, let's go and go over what these new components are. So, like I mentioned before, last year I hit this point, and I'm like, all right, it's time to hit the drawing board. I'm going to go ahead and properly design these parts. And it took me a little while to design them. This is one of those things I really wanted to make sure all of my ducks were in a row. And I had to pace myself on these because there's a lot of moving parts, figuratively and literally, like I mentioned earlier. And this is one of those things where you want to make sure everything is lining up appropriately, or else the piece just won't function. So to start with, we'll have the spring shoe right over here, is what I refer to as the spring shoe, or it's a spring platform. It's exactly what it does. This unit here is what the springs would actually sit on. And this is what gives the suspension its suspense, I guess, best way to put it. Oops. Anyway, the unit itself, again, is all 3D printed, and all these 3D printed parts, by the way, are done with FDM. This was also one of the weaker aspects of the original old school cast resin suspension, was that if the parts do work just fine on lighter models up to about 40 pounds or so. However, if the model is heavier than that, and I did run into this on my Viper M4 Sherman that I built about 10 years ago, if the model is significant weight, what will eventually happen, if the model is sitting on suspension for prolonged periods of time, it can develop warpage in these arms over here and even in the swing arms. And this is just something with the nature of cast resin. With 3D print, this definitely alleviates this problem, and these pieces are much more durable and stronger compared to the old cast resin counterparts. Occasionally, another problem with the cast resin is that it is more fragile compared to 3D print. And although this never happened to me, this is something that could potentially happen, where if you're putting the model on uneven terrain, you can actually bust a swing arm. And again, not something that's the best situation. The working suspension does alleviate a lot of that, but sometimes the suspension might be overloaded for one reason or another, and you have the potential risk of busting a swing arm, or even an H-frame arm. I believe that has happened once. Once or twice. It's very rare for it to happen, but it has happened, I believe, in the past. I had to replace it. But either way, with these units here, that is much more unlikely, and these are far stronger compared to the other material, which again prompted me as another reason to go ahead and replace the old cast resin with 3D print. So, starting with the swing arms themselves, or this is the part of the H-frame, you can see the unit here in full light. And this is as per the real one, as much as I can possibly make. So, first thing I want to point out is the geometry. If you look, it has this nice little graceful bend to it. The old school ones were straight in their manufacturing, so again, something I learned as time went on. You can see it has the appropriate geometry of the insets right here. We have this round section, which would be found on the real unit. And also it has the correct shape of these sections here, and this was something that I was able to lift directly off of the real units I was studying. In addition to the swing arm, it also has integrally printed on the detailing for the slide plate. On the real unit, this little plate, or it's like a little shoe over here, is actually removable, and it's a wear part. And this is something that if you're doing service on the tank, you'd have to replace from time to time. It's held in place with a fastener right over here. You just undo this bolt, this guy pops out, bolt a new one on, and you're ready to roll. For the 3D print one, it's integrally printed on as one piece. I know I'm such a slacker, but it's just done for ease and convenience. And on top of that, you can see the cast numbers found on the component. So here we have OSF, which is a foundry, and it's a very commonly seen foundry on these Sherman parts. And as for the number, this here is the number right there, and this is something that I, again, took directly off of the real example. Flip it to the reverse side, we also have OSF on the other side, as well as the cast number on the reverse side, and these things are fully detailed inside and out, so no matter which way you're looking at your tank suspension, you're going to see cast foundry marks and cast numbers on the part, again, just giving the model just that much more detail and accuracy. Back to the spring shelf, here you get to see the component. On the bottom here, there are two fasteners that are just integrally printed on. On the real unit, this is, again, what would be connected to those things that I mentioned before on the inside of the housing, where you would tighten everything, and it'll prevent everything from shooting out. The other detailing is all there. It's, again, I had some fairly good references of the real unit. The only thing that's missing on these examples are the divots found in these two sections here, where the springs would actually plug into. I originally designed that into the piece. In fact, here I have the first test print right here. And the unit did originally have those well in, however, they were in slightly the wrong location. And when I assembled the test piece, the springs were just not lining up properly. So this is something that I am going to revisit as I more likely redesign the springs themselves, so that everything is uniform and it just fits in better. But for the time being, at the time of filming this, the pieces are going to be divotless like you see here, and these still work just fine. Oh, touching back to what I mentioned before, the pieces are FDM, however, the FDM is very, very, very smooth. Also, the material of FDM is a nylon type material, which gives it added strength over just the standard PLA material or that other material that escapes me at the moment. I have a spool of it running around, but either way, it is a filament-based print, but it's a very good filament-based print. The pieces, as you can see if I bring it up to the camera, are very, very smooth, and are some of the best FDM prints I've ever seen. Back to this guy over here, which is a little bit easier seen with the cast numbers. It just speaks for itself. So this is going to be a fantastic item. I'm going to do I don't see myself doing any prep work on these pieces here outside just getting them painted and primed. The other components that were printed, of course, were the swing arms. And as I mentioned before, here we have the swing arms. And the keen-eyed amongst you will notice that I have not one, but both patterns. And this, again, was a carryover from the old cast wrestling ones where I did the same thing. So let's start with this version right here. Oop, there we go. Anyway, so you can see the component. It has all the correct geometry of the real component. We have these stops over here, which is an over-travel stop, and it prevents the suspension from just bottoming out like that. And it basically locks into the one on the opposite side, much along this manner. It has, just like the old cast wrestling ones, the mounting fastener for the axle integrally printed on. Is the correct scale. And on this unit here, without the wrench slits, you see it has those blisters found in these sections over here. And on the inner portion, you get to see some more geometry of an internal bushing, as well as also this reinforcement section that is scalloped out. Again, all of this is lifted directly from the real units. And this leads us to this bit of equipment that I mentioned before. So, like I mentioned on the A-train piece, it has that shoe that rides on this section over here, and this is a matching track for that shoe to ride on, and also helps keep it aligned. On the other unit, it was a separate piece of cast angle, essentially. It was a piece I milled out and then made a mold of it. And on this unit here, it's integrally printed on. In addition to the piece, it also has the internal detailing of the slot screws that are integrally printed on. So no other detailing or body work or any type of work is required by the builder outside just getting things painted and fitted to the suspension housing. Just like with the other part, it has some cast numbers right over there as well as the foundry mark. Hopefully it comes in focus, but hopefully you get to see it right there. The number is correct to the swing arm, as again I just directly lifted off of a real example. And as for the other unit, this is the other option. So originally these units would have been seen on more earlier production units. It's more common to see this on vehicles like the M3 Lees and vehicles similar. Then what eventually happened was the feedback from the field was that these units left some room for improvement because of the way these things are manufactured. They are drilled and tapped in order for you to screw these units in place. And this is actually something that was proven to be a bit problematic because either the screws can strip, or if the piece gets rusty and you have to take it out, you could destroy the threads on the inside, and this leads to some issues. So what the designers went and did was they revised it to this pattern that we have here with now the use of 2 wrench slits. With the use of the wrench slits, this makes the unit easier to manufacture, where you don't have to tap these sections over here, which can require a bit of extra machine time. Instead, you just drill them out through and through, and then you have a literal hex fastener on the opposite side that retains everything in place. The only thing you have to do is supply yourself with a longer bolt, and you're good to go. With this design, if the unit gets seized or needs to be replaced in what way and you can't get those screws out, you just simply cut off or just destroy the nuts over here, and the piece can just fall apart, and then you can get access and replace them with a fresh set. So this was a much better design in that respect. Just like with the other one, it also has its cast marks right over there. And outside of the addition of the wrench slits, you get to see the other geometry and how everything is curved and rounded, and again, just a dead ringer from the real unit. As for why I have both examples, because this unit, I should say this model is going to have both units fitted in place, and that's part of the charm with Sherman tanks. It's not uncommon to have these components intermix with one another willy-nilly, and that's just part of the charm and something I've been doing on my Sherman builds for a long time now, and it's definitely something I'm going to continue to do. On the catalog, these are going to be sold as an option where you get them with the wrench slits or without, or if anyone just wants a mix and match, just let me know and I'll gladly go ahead and oblige. The way the units go together is we have the housing over here. We now have an extra pin, this little 1/16 of an inch pin over here, which I'm going to tap in place off camera. With the piece tapped in place, I'll then just take these H-frame parts and slide them in, just like you see here. And at this point, you'll see that it has 2 little pegs sticking out from the section. This is extremely important. I'll mention why in a minute. So as I stated before, the swing arms, or I should say the suspension, has the springs in this section over here. And as you can see, with the piece being hinged like this, it can articulate and flex without the springs having to change their orientation. So the tank goes over rough terrain, and it's doing all of this, and the springs only move in up and down motion. However, to do this, I had to make one slight modification to the housing itself. If I grab the housing, as I mentioned before, I have to make a slight little mod to the front and rear section. And you'll see that I went ahead and milled in a little slot found in this section in the middle, as well as also in this section in the middle. This is a guide, and it helps keep the thing aligned and will prevent the H-frame from moving around. And as you can see, I can just slide this guy directly in, just like so. And it's held in place. So now it can only move in a linear motion in this direction. On the real units, there is a track integrally molded into the housing, and it's just made up of just some built-up areas of casting on either of these sections, which is why, by the way, the H-frame has this geometric shape to it where it's not straight and has this little dog-leg bend to it. If you look at the piece from the inside, you can see the dog-leg is required in order for it to clear these 2 sections, which would have the built-up material in these areas. On my example over here, I went ahead and added the milled-in slots. However, if/when I go ahead and make new castings of new molds of the housings themselves, I will be sure to slightly revise these units where they have the rails integrally built in. But for the time being, the milled in slots is going to be the format that these components are going to be offered in. And as you can see, it does the job quite well. If I take two of these springs over here, just drop them into the housing. Then line this guy up, slide him in. You can see how the slot over here prevents the springs from moving about. And it just keeps them going in an up and down manner. And the part can function just like the real unit. That's going to be fun once the unit's fitted to the tank. So, now that you've seen how the sausage is made, no point talking from this point out. I'm going to go ahead and get everything primed that you see here on the table, as well as also get some more steel rods cut to length. And then I can go ahead and get these units assembled and, most importantly, fitted to the tank. So let's go ahead and cut across one that's already accomplished. The paint and assembly work. Hopefully I don't break anything on my way there. So while I was going through the motions of painting, or I should say pre-priming and painting the suspension, I'm also going to do the same thing to the lower hull. Here we have the hull outside, and at this point here, the primer has been added, and I was actually in the process of adding the base coat until I realized, oh crap, let me go ahead and quickly set up the tripod and record some information, otherwise it'll be lost. So at this point, just like with the suspension parts, I always like to prime and paint the lower hulls, because once the suspension gets fitted on in place, again, getting access to these locations aren't going to be that readily available, so it's much easier at this time. The keen-eyed amongst you will know that currently it's missing those rigidity braces that I mentioned in the previous video, which are found on the lower portion of the Sherman hull. These are, of course, going to be fitted. They're going to be primed and painted, and they're going to be added after the suspension is fitted in place, because if I add them now, I'm not really sure where the suspension is going to go at this time. It's not finalized yet, so I want to make sure that they're going to be in the appropriate location. That's best done after the suspension is fitted. And of course, those will be fitted at the end of this video once the suspension is bolted on in place. After the pieces are added, I could do some touch-ups and then also go with the weathering, but that's a topic for another scene. Back to this one over here. As you can see, the lower hull has been primed. For primer, I just use El Cheapo Flat Black spray paint. And this, again, is going to be a bit different compared to some other builds out there. Generally, on my smaller scale stuff, I tend to roll with flat black for my primer. For my larger scale 1/6 scale stuff, I tend to roll with red or gray primer. However, those are with the caveat that the thing is radio controlled. This being a static tank here, going with the more expensive paints for the primer is just not necessary. So I just went with El Cheapo Flat Black, as it works the same as it does on the small scale ones. As I always mention in these videos, regardless of whatever paint you're using, you have to go ahead and prime the surface. It just makes the paint stick better, be it either some Gucci type brand of paint or, like I like to use, exterior latex house paint. And on that note, that's exactly what I'm going to be using for the base coat. Here you can see some of the base coat has been applied. It's, again, my own mix of U.S. Armor World War II olive drab. It's the same color that I've used on many builds on this channel, from small to large. This is basically my go-to for most of my World War II pattern of vehicles, specifically American, of course. The paint is applied via my spray gun right over here. This one here is my Harbor Freight little miniature spray gun. This was a fantastic quality piece. I picked it up for about maybe 11 bucks, if that, and so far it's been working quite well. For something big like 1/6 scale, for instance, you don't want to use that tiny little standard airbrush. That's best. I mean, you could do it, but it's going to be a much longer job, and you're going to put a hell of a lot of wear and tear on your airbrush. For my 1/6 scale stuff, you want to go with a spray gun just for the generic base coat. For the finer stuff, like the fine tuning and airbrush weathering, that's done with the airbrush. So again, exterior latex is my go-to for my 1/6 scale and pretty much most of my model tanks. It's diluted with just standard tap water. I have the right mixture, the right ratio. Mix that, stir it up, and then it's ready for applying to the model. Also, it seems like for some reason it's a point of contention on my builds where I use this paint. It seems to piss people off either in small scale or large scale, and the funny thing is that people generally say that either have no content on their channel, or if they do have content and they have builds, they really shouldn't be giving me advice, because frankly their builds aren't really that hot. But not to throw stones at anybody specifically. With that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and apply the remainder of the paintwork on the lower section here with the spray gun. Also, you'll see that I went ahead and added the primer. I did a slight overspray on these bottom sections over here, and that's something that you want to do, because on this area we're going to have that fender strip that's going to be fitted in place later on, and it's always best to have a bit of overspray in this section over here, because when it comes time to do the final paint work, I tend to mask these areas up here, so it's okay to have some overspray. It just makes the overlap of paint come out a bit easier, and it just has better results, I find, from all of my other builds in the past. However, that will be more noticeable towards the end of the project when the thing is sliding off into full paint, but more on that to come. So from here, I'm going to go ahead, mask up, power up my air compressor, and continue the remainder of the paintwork. And here's the outcome of the paint work. The hull has been completely painted at this point. It's ready for the installation and the assembly of the suspension. Well, not in that order, but you get my drift. The paint goes onto the surface really easily, and it dries really fast, specifically in this very beautiful July weather. So this thing here is all ready to progress further. And as for what the suspension looks like in part form, well, and here's what the VVSS suspension looks like, sans the wheels, fully primed and painted and ready for assembly. Well, not those two. Pay no attention to those. That's for another project. Those are about to slide off into paint. But outside of that, this is basically on par on what you generally expect to see on a 1/6 scale tank with a working suspension. Trying to paint everything and lay it out is something that is a bit tricky. You can easily lose a part, so you have to use some caution. The best thing to do is I like to take large cardboard boxes like this one over here. This is, I believe, from a shelf or whatever, and I keep it folded away in the shop for this type of purpose. For Shermans, there's plenty of parts, as you can see, but this is also true for the German tanks, such like ones with interwoven wheels. There's quite a lot of components. On any tank, the suspension is the most complex part of the entire build, which is why it's also the most intricate, and it's the part that will make or break you. So with that in mind, we have all the parts here laid out on the table. So you get to see the swing arms right here. Hopefully that gets into focus. There we go. It's been prelim primed, and the base coat has been added. Same thing here with the spring shoe, as well as the swing arms. Now that it's fully painted, hopefully the thing could go into focus and get to see those cast numbers I was referencing before. And these are going to come out really nice once the weathering goes on them. Also, I might as well throw it out there, if anyone out there knows what this is for, feel free to put that in the comment section below. It'll be interesting to see if any sleuths out there are able to guess what exactly this is and what scale it is too, I might add. So, looking forward to those responses. So after a few moments, you can see the assembly taking shape. These units here have their H-frames fully assembled with the springs placed into the housing. After the last H-frame is assembled, then we're going to start with the installation of the swing arms, which are going to compress the springs and leaving for the condition that we have here, but we'll see what that looks like momentarily. I just want to briefly go over the assembly of the new unit. So we have the housing right here. I'm just going to take the springs, drop them directly into place. Now, some people may be wondering, well, John, can you mount on the idler mount before the assembly of the springs? And the answer is yeah, you can. I have done that in the past. Basically, both ways will lead to Rome. But let's just go ahead and go with this method here. So the springs just get dropped into the housing. Here I have my guide pin. The guide pin was carefully cut and ground to the length so that it doesn't pop off when the piece is installed. And this is important to point out because if the guide pin is not riding in the track perfectly, it's just going to cause the suspension not to articulate properly. So this is actually very important. And it appears here that I am slightly out of spec. Oh, no, I'm in spec. Wait, am I in spec? Yep, cool. I'm in spec, as you can see right here. That's exactly what you want. Okay, so I'm going to start by putting the pin into the shoe over here. I have a drill off camera over here. I'm with an 1/8 of an inch drill bit. I'm just using that to clean out the hole, remove any sort of built up residue from the layers of paint from the painting process. And then from here, I'm just going to go ahead and push this all the way through. This one actually went in really, really well. On the other ones, I had to put the piece on the vise and just tap the piece in gently with a hammer to get the same effect, but either way will work. For the swing arms here, they are in good shape. And let me go ahead and drill these out. Okay, there we have it. These guys just slide into place like this. If they're a little stiff, again, a few wraps with a hammer off camera on the vise will seat them properly in place. One moment, please. Okay, as you can see, the pieces were seated in place and they can still pivot perfectly fine. And at this point here, these are just going to slide into their location. Like so. And there we have it. The H-frame has been mounted onto the model. And now it's time to get the swing arms and the mounting pins and complete the next leg of the assembly. And here we have the suspension at the next leg of the assembly, which is to put on the swing arms. These ones here have been fitted in place, as you can see. And this one here is the last set, so I might as well go ahead and show exactly how the unit goes together. So here we have the H-frame as we saw in the last scene. And now we're going to go ahead and mount on the swing arms. Here I have the pieces of steel rod that were cut. They are cut to shape. I went ahead and painted them with olive drab because a little piece of the rod is exposed right there. On the real unit, there would be a spacer in this section over here, but the rod definitely still looks the part even though the spacer is not yet present, or it's not going to be present on this example. At some point in time, that is something that may be subject to change, but for now, we're just rolling with it in that format. So the first thing I'm going to do is just like with the the small pin, I'm going to go ahead and just take a drill bit and just go through the hole just to clear out of any sort of residue, because again, it's going to help the piece perform better. And for something like this, you really want it to articulate nice and smooth. If it's sticky and hangs up, obviously it's less than ideal. For the drill bit I'm using, that would be a 1764 drill bit. If you're a metric persuasion, I can't help you on that one, but it's just mounted in this cordless drill here, and I'm just going to go up and down just like so. As we saw, a little bit of crud came out. And it doesn't really take much to go ahead and clean the holes out. Voila. All right, so now that that's been taken care of, I'm going to go ahead and slide the pieces in place. Now that should be really easy because, again, of the material removed. If that doesn't swing or show how easy the pieces are swinging, I don't know what will. And I'm going to mount them in place. You'll notice that on this model here, the swing arms are just a mix between the one with the wrench slits and the ones that are solid, like I mentioned before. As for which ones go where, completely random. Again, true to form to the real vehicle. So, I'm going to start the install. Before I do that, though, I am also going to pre-pin these ones in place, like so. You want to make sure that they're going in the exact same direction, because like I said before, these are left and right hand specific. So that's really all you need. So when it comes time to mounting them in place, obviously the part with the angle piece is going to be pointing downward as this is the track for the H-frame shoe to slide on. And you know what? As for orientation, I'm going to put this end here without the paint so that I could insert into this section here of the bogie housing. Without the paint, it makes it a little bit easier to slide in place. So to do that, I'm just going to depress on the spring and just jiggle the piece in place, just like so. You may need some slight coercion. This one did slide in pretty well, but in case a little bit of coercion is needed, you just, with your fingers, you depress onto the piece over here. Make sure you're on a nice, sturdy surface, of course. And then once the spring pressure is removed, you can see how the pin has no more pressure on it in there. You can just tap it to seat it in further. And that's it. That one's in place. No lubricants or any other type of material is required. Just basically slide it on in. I'll go ahead and flip these around. As you can see, without the spacer in place, it does make the installation a little bit more convenient. So again, push down. Then just wiggle the guy into place. If the pieces are not sliding where they need to go, do not force it. That means there's some kind of a blockage either with the springs or with the swing arm, and if you try to force it, you run the risk of breaking something, and that's definitely not something that you want to have happen to you. And that's it. That's all there is to it. So these guys are now fitted in place. You want to make sure that the H-frame lines up on the rails, and everything should just snap into place once the things are where they need to be. At this point here, I'm now going to add the lock plate right here. And to do that, I'm going to first add some super glue into these sections. These things should not be removable. Once these things are fitted in place, the need to disassemble it is no longer relevant. So I like to use just a drop of glue. On my example over here, I did tap these holes. On the production ones, I'm on the fence of whether or not I'm going to tap them or not, but in the past I've done both. It just depends really how I feel, I guess. But if you are interested in the set, you want them tapped, just let me know, and I'll definitely oblige. So here we have the three fasteners that are going to do it. One is shorter than the other two. I'm going to use the short one in the center over here. I'm also going to add some CA to the threads, also to the flat surfaces where it makes contact with the bogie housing. I'll line the thing up and then just install with a socket driver. With the way the suspension is designed, the lock plate isn't really that important, which is why I was just cringing the use of having threaded resin into these sections over here. If you're afraid the bomb's going to shoot out. With the way the suspension is designed, is that once the tank is sitting on it, the weight is being pushed downward, and actually the bars are being pushed upward against this section over here. So this block plate doesn't really have a whole lot of force on it at any given time. So this assembly method works perfectly fine. And all the other tanks I built with the exact same suspension set are holding up pretty well. So you know, this is not exactly a problem or anything that is a rise of concern. Or at least I've noticed. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead, drip a little bit more super glue into those sections, and then just slide these two guys into place right here. Like I stated before, if/when I go ahead and ever get to retooling or refreshing the molds for the bogie housings, I'll probably be making some slight adjustments to the master, where the assembly will be in a slightly different format, but it is still something that will be very similar to this. Fainting the assembly will probably be a little bit easier, because since I designed these sets, I learned a bit more in the years that followed, as we can see with the design of the new H-frame. However, the bogie housings would still be made out of cast resin for the reasons that I mentioned before. It's probably one of the few things I will keep in cast resin on the ECA catalog in perpetuity. So then you just tighten these down. You don't want to over tighten them. Obviously, you're just threading into cast resin. Just bottom it out until it stops. And there you go. At this point here, nice little test. And that's perfect. And there we have it. So with the suspension sprung, at this point here, it's now time to focus on the top extremities. This would be mounting on the idler mount as well, or I should say the return roller mount, and also the skid rail. Which, when we're done, will look something like this. And just like that with the magic editing, the idler mounts are being fitted in place. Here we have the last one, and I just wanted to mention some things just before we move on to the next scene. So the idler mounts are just simply glued on place at first. There are some metal fasteners that get glued on that are purely just there for detail purposes, but are also there to offer some rigidity. And when you're installing the pieces, you just want to bear some things in mind. So I'll just go ahead and start by just gluing the piece in place. So here we go, just a little swipe of super glue in this section over here on these rails. Just like so. Don't want to put too much, but just, you know, a little bit. A little bit up there, and then the piece just self-indexes accordingly. So when you're lining these up, you want to make sure that this line over here basically joins up with that angle section that we have right there. And then that's basically just press down on the piece for a few seconds, let the glue do its thing, and then the piece is now tacked on. The other thing I want to mention when it comes time for mounting these on in place is you want to keep count on which side you're working on. Like I stated before, these pieces are removable, and you can mount the bracket on the reverse side as you need to do, like this one here. This one's for one side of the tank, this one's for the other. And the reason why I need to mention this is because when you're going through the motions, you can easily just make a mistake where you accidentally glue the bracket on the same side of all six, or on a number that is much more than you need for one side. And if that happens, you basically just made your life a little bit more complex. So when you're going through the motions, just do the dirty, hairy thing and just basically count every round that you do. If you do that, you'll be perfectly fine, and you'll never have an issue of any other issues. Or I should say, any issue of the piece being mounted on the wrong side on too many units. So with that out of the way, the glues are setting, and at this point here, once they fully set, I'm going to go ahead and mount on some fasteners. I could either do that right now, or I could also just mount on the skid rail. Either way will work. So the skid rail secures in place like this here. It'll go on the top portion, and basically lines up with that bracket that we have right here, integrally molded into the housing. And it just lines up like so. There are some holes integrally molded in. Don't follow those. Those are just basically carryovers from the old tooling unit where I used to use sheet metal for these sections. These are now 3D print, so that's not necessary. And basically, it just gets held in place with some fasteners. The fasteners I'm using are these 256 brass fasteners that as always, I don't have on the table right now. One moment. Right over here. And by the way, this is my vendor that I do get my fasteners from. I can't give them a bigger shout out. Great people. I always place my order on the phone, and they were very awesome to deal with. If anyone's curious on the sizes that I use, right there for the following units. Although these are a bit on the longer side, you could buy them shorter, which I do have off camera, or you could just use the longer ones if need be and just cut them shorter. Either way will work. So for the fasteners, you are going to need several. On the rear bracket over here, there are 4 found in these areas. On the real ones, there's sometimes some safety wire that gets tied in between. I'm not going to be able to do that on the smaller one. I know I'm such a slacker, you know, that's just how it goes. But you also have 2 on the front portion here, 2 on the rear, but then there are also 2 more on the bracket. There's 4 on the bracket total. So there's 2 that sandwich the skid rail to the idler mount or the roller mount, and then there are 2 others that secure the roller mount bracket directly to the housing itself. So it's something you want to pay attention to. A lot of kits out there, they tend to make that mistake where they just mold the 2 in, or they don't even mold anything at all, depending on the kit in question. But that is something to consider. If anyone, by the way, is curious, I have some photographs of the real M4A3s that I've had the opportunity to video and photograph, and the Facebook link to the photo gallery of both of those can be found in the video description below. Recommend checking those out, specifically if you're going all crazy on a Sherman build like, well, yours truly. And here's the bracket with the 4 bolts fitted in place. To do this, I first marked the section here with a Sharpie just to know exactly where they go. Now, you can go ahead and carefully measure out exactly where they need to be. Me personally, I've done this so many times, it's basically muscle memory at this point. So I know exactly where the holes got to go. The holes are drilled out with this cordless drill over here. I just carefully drill out these sections. The 2 on the top are going into solid resin, so there's no worries about any sort of the bit busting through in a place where it shouldn't. The 2 down below are on either side here of the spring housing, and you have to be careful on the length of the bolt, because if the bolt is too long, it may strike the spring, which obviously will inhibit the suspension, which is less than ideal. As for the fasteners, I wasn't able to find the shorter ones, so I'm just going to use the longer ones here. I just shorten them to length, and I just glue them in place. You can use a smaller bit than the one I'm using here, and then you can actually thread the pieces in place if you have the small little hex driver that are also sold by Micro Fasteners, if you so choose to do so. For me, though, I just drill them out with the slightly bigger bit, and I just glue them in place. Even though this may be considered a travesty to some people out there, remember, this is a static tank, so the propensity of this thing needing to be held on with fasteners is not really that great. And even though the hole's slightly larger than it needs to be, with the metal and the glues in place, it still does a good job with holding it in. And again, I never really had a problem in the past. So I'm going to go ahead and drill these sections out. So like I stated before, you just line it up. Oop. It's funny, it's always easier to do without it being on camera, but the only thing that's limiting how deep the bit can go is the length of the arm over here and also the length of the bit. So as you can see, I have it basically just barely stuck in the chuck over here to the point where it could still stay true. A lot of times when you do that, the bit can wobble. Don't do that. That's not going to help you. So right here. Once it bottoms out, you're good to go. Do the same thing with the 2 on the bottom. These ones will poke through because, like I stated before, there is a hollow cavity in there for the well for the spring. And there you have it. So from here, I'm going to go ahead, take the fasteners, and I'm just going to go ahead and shorten them a little bit, like about this long. I just eyeball it again. I've done this so many times at this point. For the ones on the top, I tend to leave them longer than the ones on the bottom for the reasons that I mentioned before. So I just go ahead, trim it, add a little swipe of glue, and just drop them into place as you can see there. Do the same thing with the one on the bottom, just so I can get on camera. Only the one on the bottom going to be a little bit shorter with the length of the fastener, like that. Drop that guy in place. And you can test it to see if it makes any impact. And it does not. It clears it perfectly. Exactly what you're looking for. So I'll go ahead and finish off the fasteners. When it's done, it will look like this right here, as you can see. And then from there, I'll be able to do the last leg of the installation, which will be, or I should say the next leg of the installation, which will be the skid rail, followed by the return roller itself. Another component fitted, another step closer to completion. The skid rail just gets fitted right to the top portion over here, and here go the bolt pattern that I was referring to before. We have the two on either end, and the two on the skid rail that also double acts as holding it on, or just being an extra bit of support and structure to keep the bracket in place. Here we have the unit ready for installation right here. The trickiest part is to mark the holes and drill out the holes where the fasteners need to go. And because of the geometry of everything over here, it's really hard to go ahead and get in there with a pencil. But there is a trick to get in here, and I'll show you how to do that. So the life hack to get this marked is to take a paintbrush here with some flat black paint. And I'm just going to go ahead and carefully line up the bracket like you see right here. The bracket just gets centered right here on the piece, and also you can see how the bracket lines up with the edges. And once you're at that point there, you are ready to start marking. So with the paintbrush, I'm just going to go ahead and find the hole that's integrally printed onto the bracket, just like so. And then I just go ahead and put the little drop of paint in that location. At that point there, I remove it, and now we have the locations where the thing needs to be drilled out. I'm going to go ahead, wash out the brush, and I'll be back to drill everything out and to get everything fitted in place. To drill it out, I have my drill right here, and I'm just going to basically aim for center mass on each of the holes. This should more or less give you the correct location. I'm drilling in up to the threads over here, which appears to be about ½ an inch or so, which is more than suffice for the task at hand. And there we go. Once that's drilled out, just wipe off the extra. At this point here, I'm ready to start the installation. So I'll first go ahead and just inject some glue into this section over here. Get the paint off of the bottom of the skid. And add the glue to the following locations. Go ahead, snip these guys, like so. Position the first fastener in place, like so. Add a little extra glue for good measure, and then just slip into the piece accordingly. And there's the first. Second, I'm going to use this plier over here to help align it up. And then the piece, once it finds its sweet spot, the bolt will just slide right in place. Once the front is installed, then just drill out the two locations for the back. Easily done. Just after the holes are drilled, just get rid of the powder that accumulates over there, because it'll actually interfere with the installation. Then once that's done, as you can imagine, a little drop of glue in the correct locations, and the piece is then ready for mounting. There's one. There's the other. And the skid rail is now fitted in place. for the other two fasteners that almost everybody forgets about, I'm just going to go ahead and mark these two locations, here and here. And as one may imagine, just drill and glue. And there we have it. So once these are fitted on in place, the next thing to do is to mount on the return roller. And here we're at the last step prior to installation. As you can see, the return rollers have been fitted in place, and the unit is looking like a Sherman VVSS. So here we have the last unit here, and like I've done before on the other portions of the assembly, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through it. So here we have the axle for the return roller. I went ahead and taped up the center portion just so that no paint gets on it, which can really clunk up the rotation of the wheel and make it stiffer to not only rotate but also to install in place. Rotating is not really that important because, again, it is a static tank. However, it's good to have the pieces rotate just because it makes it feel better in my opinion. But also, if you want, or when it comes time to paint the surfaces here, it's easier done when you can spin the thing as opposed if it's just locked in place. Also, it just makes it more properly engineered, I find. So, during the primer and paint work, the piece was masked up, and now I'm going to go ahead and remove said mask. Put this guy in the trash. Alright. With the axle now with the tape removed, I'm going to go ahead and prep these two areas here on the under portions of the axle. And these areas here need to be cleaned off just so it makes for a better surface for the glue to do its job. Scrape it off here with the X-Acto, or in my case the miniature box cutter that really needs a new blade, but it's still doing the job pretty fine for now. And there we have it. This guy here is now ready for the next step. Here we have the wheel here in my hand, and just like before, I'm going to go ahead and drill out the center portion just to widen up the tolerances, get rid of any sort of paint buildup. I'm using the same larger diameter drill bit that I used before on the steel axles. Also, one thing I want to mention, as we saw before, the pieces were pretty rough because the molds were worn out, so I had to do a little bit of sanding on them, and now that the pieces are painted, you get to see the surface, and the piece looks absolutely perfect. At this point here, just slide this guy in place. A little on the stiff side, but that's perfectly fine. The stiff sections are where the paint are, and this will definitely work itself loose. But it's loose enough to rotate, specifically once the glues do their job. So with this guy here ready to go, set him aside, I'm now going to go ahead and just remove the tape, or I should say the paint, off of these two areas here on the bracket. The X-Acto does some really short work of it, as you can see. Right there, I got the resin poking through. And that's all there is to it. From here, I'm just going to add a little drop of glue. And then I'm just going to drop the thing in place. On the wheel, this side here is a bit rough, so this is going to be on the back portion of the bogie housing, so the nice portion is facing towards the viewer. Then just line the thing up and drop the axle onto the appropriate locations. And you just basically eyeball it, make sure it's nice and square. And then that's it. Once the piece is properly lined up, step back and let the glues do its job. At that point there, the return roller has been mounted permanently to the unit. And that's all there is to the construction of the ECA bogie. At this point here, I'm going to go ahead and just touch up some of the new areas with some paint, i.e. the new fastener locations. I'm probably going to hit it with a little paintbrush of flat black, and then I'll go over it with the airbrush with the base coat one more time for good measure, just to make sure everything's thoroughly painted. But that's all there is to it. Once that's completed, I'm going to go ahead, throw the wheels on, and then we can get these things fitted in place. But as for the wheels, well, there's something I need to mention about that too. With the suspension fully assembled, the last thing to mention that needs to be put on the suspension, we'll just roll with that, are of course the road wheels. And in the past, the VVSS Sherman road wheels was something that was a staple on the ECA catalog, and it was one that was offered in a multitude of different configurations for many years. Well, I went ahead and not only tooled up a new version of the road wheel that hasn't been done in 1/6 scale at this point, but also I began to revisit the older ones. The older ones were all made out of a solid cast resin component, and then it was just like basically like the ones you see on 1/35 scale tanks. Solid wheel, install in place, you paint it and paint the tire with some black paint, and you're good to go. Well, about 10 years ago, I've wanted to go ahead and revisit that because at that time, I saw that I was able to go ahead and cast components in rubber, and I figured it would be really cool to have the road wheels where they're using real rubber parts. This is great on a multitude of reasons. First, you're using real rubber, so you don't have to paint anything, and that already saves you some time. The other thing is, there's no point trying to mimic rubber when you can actually use real rubber. It just adds a little bit more gravitas to the build. And the last thing is, unlike the paint, rubber doesn't scratch. And that's one problem with using solid cast resin for your road wheels. They look just fine. However, they do have the propensity on scratching just from basic handling, or if the model gets pushed or moved. The resin the paint tends to scratch off, and I have resin poking through, and it's something that does hurt the look of the build. And it's always something that you just have to live with for the longest time and just touch it up here or there. Well, all that is alleviated with the use of rubber components. And here we have the new generation of ECA VVSS Sherman road wheels. And these ones here are going to be the first in the series, and as time goes on, I will tool up the other variants. But for now, we have two versions of the late pattern dish wheel. And you can see both patterns here on the table, both of which are containing basically the same design, or using the same design, I should say. And that's with the use of a rim, or I should say a center section that's made out of 3D print, and then we have a rubber tire that's made out of cast rubber. However, the master is made from a resin 3D print, and I'll go into more of that in a moment. There are some other parts that are going to be included with the sets that we don't see yet on the table, one of which are the Zerk fittings that are used for the grease plugs that go on either side here of the road wheels, and you'll see that once I bring the thing in closer. At the moment, I don't have the Zerk fittings yet. Those are still in manufacture, but generally I install those at the tail end of the build anyway, and I'll revisit that as the project goes to the final portion of its build. The other thing that is also included that's not found on the table is a section of wire, or I should say steel rod, because that's necessary to get the two halves of the wheels together. So we'll start with the left and work our way to the right. So starting with the first row wheel, we have this pattern here, which is your standard dish wheel. This is one of the later pattern dish wheels, and what's interesting to point out is that the Sherman row wheels first started off as open spokes, which was a carryover from the M2 medium tank, then later the M3, and then there were several other variants in between. That's part of the fun in Sherman, just how many different row wheel variants there are. And then at the very tail end of the war, they basically had this design here, which mimicked very similarly the design found on the early production Tiger 1, oddly enough, where we just have a concave stamping right here with the grease fittings in place in these little wells. And we also have these bushing sections here, which are found on all the other Sherman road wheels. These pieces here are 3D printed out of a filament type print, so there are some scan lines. However, like with the swing arms, they're actually really, really fine for the manufacturing method. However, these ones here I am going to polish up a little bit. Fortunately, with the design of this piece here, polishing it up is actually fairly easy because there's no detail on the surface, so it lends itself very efficient for that type of a polish method with just some super glue, some wet sanding, and basically you're good to go. You'll notice that the wheels are a 2-half assembly. This is to optimize the filament material that's used, or I should say the filament method used for manufacture. If I would use an SLS, it would have been a single rim. Unfortunately, the price would have been very, very high, and each wheel would have been not very cost effective. By going with this method here, it's a good balance between cost effectiveness and also good detailing. The this pattern of the dish wheel, I actually have a cast resin variant. Again, it's been on the catalog now since 2004. It's actually one of the first pieces I designed when I first got my lathe, believe it or not. And although those pieces are still going to stay on the catalog, I'm not going to remove them just yet because the molds are actually in pretty good shape for those, and because they are going to be offered as a cost-effective alternative to this pattern here, which is going to cost more than this cast resin one. It's just the way it goes. But for as long as the molds are still good, I'll still offer that one on the catalog. Those ones are still good for several options if you just want to have us use it as a spare, or if the need of the rubber tire just is one that you deem not really necessary, that would probably be a better bet for the time being. However, I will say that I will continue to offer those on the catalog, and this is all dependent on the mold. Once the mold starts to degrade and the castings are no longer capable of outputting a quality part, at that point there, that set's going to be put out the pasture and will be registered as OOP, and then this one here will just be in production from that point onward. So as for this section here, like I said, it was a 2-part assembly, and because of that, you need to glue the 2 halves together, and that's why we have these index points here. This is why I stated before there are going to be some metal rods that come with these sets, and basically you just glue the pegs in place, and the pieces are intended to line up in a certain way. You notice we have the part marked A right here. Hopefully that comes out on camera, and the B part doesn't have any markings on it because, well, the A's all have the markings. The holes are lined up in a way where they only get to assemble in one direction, so you can't mix that up. And basically, you just want to dry fit it before you go ahead and add the adhesives. And then once the thing is glued in place, you now have your center plug section of the wheel ready to go. This brings us now to the second pattern of late wheel. This pattern is actually the first time this wheel has ever been offered in 1/6 scale. And yes, it took me about 10 years, about 15 at this point, to finally get to these wheels and make them. But here we are, I finally got around to it. This design here kind of bridges the gap between the final flat pattern wheel and also the earlier spoke stamped pattern of wheel. And this one, again, it's like a hybrid of the two. This one here features a multitude of different components that are then stamped and then riveted in place, giving you the appearance here of the wheel. Unlike this one here where it's a concave type shape, this one here is convex. For both of the wheels, by the way, I had some excellent reference material, so I was really able to transmit as much as I possibly can, the detailing and features I'm found on each, onto the version here. So if we look closely, you'll see that the section that would be stamped is a clear, identifiable part, and you can see it even has its stampings replicated where it needs to curve. It's actually bent and curved, and then we also see that here on this section on the middle, which again lends itself to mimicking the look of the stampings. On the perimeter here, we have all of the dome-headed rivets that are integrally, again, printed on, and we also have this weird step section over here, again lifted directly from the real one. We have the wells for the Zerk fittings, as you can see. These ones here are also made with the same type of nylon filament used on the other one. However, unlike the versions that I have here, these ones are actually pretty clean, and the need for polishing I don't think is really necessary, or it's going to need as much compared to the other version. The other version is pretty good, specifically for an FDM print, but that's just, I don't know, just the way these designs came out. It seems it just lends itself for better it's more efficient with that type of manufacturing method. We have the same type of bushing found on the front section over here as we have on the other one. In fact, it's the exact same file. I just copy and paste. And just like with the other design, we have here A and B side. Again, the A sides, Butterfingers, the A side is right over here, while the B side is not marked. Again, these sections are meant to pin together, and they can only go together one way. Like I mentioned before, unlike this version, there are no cast resin counterparts of this section. This is the first time this was fabricated and listed on the 1/6 scale marketplace. And this brings us to the coolest aspect of the set, in my opinion, that are the tires. So like I stated before, all of the positive attributes that these tires have made in this material. And this was, again, something I've always wanted to do. In the past, I was actually going to do it the old-fashioned way, where I go ahead and turn a master on my lathe, and then I could go ahead and make the mold and cast them in cast rubber. However, with the with the progress of time and with my techniques that I acquired over the years in CAD, I was able to design the master. And that can be found in these tire castings here, which in my opinion are probably the best I can possibly make. So here we have the casting right here. And these are production castings. These are not masters. These are not pre-production units. These are what the sets will come with. And fortunately for me to make these pieces over here, I had the beautiful references of the real M4A3 that I filmed in Pennsylvania about 2 years ago, and that's the one that gave me all these wonderful details that you're going to see here on this tire. So the first thing I want to point out is the geometry. It does have the correct geometry where we have the taper on each side right there. And the second thing is that we have, and this is again only been possible with the use of resin 3D prints, are all of the finely molded information found on the tire itself, again listed or lifted from the real example. So the real examples I was using as reference, the manufacturer was US Tire, and when it came to tire manufacture, of course, with the American system, there were several different subcontractors that were making these tires for the war effort. Some of the more famous ones, of course, brands we all know, Goodyear, BF Goodrich, and US Tire was definitely one of the more common ones. At some point in time, if there's interest, perhaps I could go ahead and design a tire from one of those other manufacturers, but we'll see how that crumbles over time. But here we go. You got to see the US Tire, and I tried to mimic the font as close as possible, but you can see that it is completely legible here on the rubber casting. On this section over here, you get to see the tire size right there, clear as day. Again, with a font that was very similar to the ones that I was able to see on the real unit, which on a Sherman, it would be 20 by 8 by 16. And then the really cool thing found on the real moldings is the term military right there, and it's actually sunk into the tire. And again, I was able to bring that to the production piece. This is something that is just going to give so much realism to this tank once they're fitted in place. And it really is going to kick this build up to the next level. In addition to just the face lettering, we also have some excellent detail on the face of the tire itself. And you can see that the tire has some really cool features going on here. So the real tires that I was using as reference had this type of setup where we had this center spine or mold line right here in the center of the tire. And then we have these segment sections that are also integrally molded on, and they are off-center from one another. As for the number count, you guessed it, lifted directly from the real one. I actually counted them. So yeah, that's what happens when I do a walk around, guys. Specifically on something that I know I'm going to be making a part of. The way I went ahead and made the molds for this was also something that I learned over time, and it's evolved from the older sets that I designed for the M3 half-track, which were the first time I actually offered cast rubber tires for a VVSS set of one flavor or another. And that set also used 3D printed masters for the mold making process, and it's kind of where I got the idea for this one here, although I shelved it for about 10 years, but here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and temporarily assemble one of these pieces. I'm not going to put the pins in just yet, but I could just slide these sections in place. So I'll just go ahead and slip these on, just so you get to see how easy they go together. And once they are together, we now have the completed tire. The tire, by the way, only has its information on the face section, and there's nothing found on the reverse side, so it's kind of hard to mix it up. So there we have it. There's one tire right here. I'll do the same thing with this guy. And there we go. Obviously, with this build here, I'm going to be doing a mix and match with the road wheels as well. This is, again, something that is very, very commonly seen on Shermans throughout the World War II time frame. And again, just another way to give your Sherman just a little bit of extra kick. From here, I'm going to go ahead and actually assemble the remainder of the wheels. And then get them pre-primed, painted, slip the rubber tires in place, and then we could go ahead and secure them to the bogie or the VVSS housings. The reason why this is important is because I kind of need the wheels on just so I know exactly where the spacing's got to be for the installation of the suspension on the tank's hull. But we'll go ahead and cut across to that. Jumping back to the lower hull, at this point here, the lower hull has been prepped and it's actually ready for the installation of the suspension. Prior to this point here, I went ahead and carefully marked the locations where the suspension is going to go, marked the fastener locations, and drilled them out. After the drilling was completed, I went ahead and marked the areas where the weld beads are found on on the rear section, and I deleted the weld beads in these areas over here for a reason that should be fairly obvious. Something else that I did on this build that differs from all the other builds in the past, in fact, you can argue that this is a mistake on my other builds, and it's one that I didn't really think about until I saw it in person on the real Shermans that I was studying. And it's also one of those things that are not found in books or even walk-around images. So this is something that is from my observation of the real units, and that involves the locations where the suspension gets fitted. So on the Sherman's lower hull, the front section here has this extra plate for reinforcement in this area. It's then welded up, and then there's a plate that shifts downward, and that continues throughout the rest of the bottom hull. Well, when it comes time for mounting on the suspension, this actually can cause a bit of concern because this section here sticks above the lower hull, or the remainder of the lower hull, and because of that, technically the suspension on the front will sit higher. However, on the real Sherman tank, there are spacers found on the lower sections over here that compensate for that shift, and it makes the suspension, all three of the units, in line perfectly with one another. And this is something that almost everybody out there misses. Some smaller scale kits probably have this adjusted for, but larger scale ones, specifically ones in 1/6 scale, absolutely not. And even a 1/16, I'll go out on a limb and say that. So what I went ahead and did was, I went ahead and made the shims that we have here. And on the real vehicle, these here would actually be welded to the lower portion of the hull in this type of format. So you would have these little sections here, and with these in place, the standard VVSS can just bolt directly to the side of the tank, and everything is where it needs to be. The shims that you see here I fabricated out of lengths of sheet styrene. It's the same exact sheet styrene that I used on the plate here in the front. If we can recall, it's double layer of sheet styrene to get the thickness, so I went ahead and just did the same thing here. With these shims added in place, I can now go ahead and secure on the suspension, but before I do that, I am going to go ahead and get these primed with just some flat black spray paint, just so that when it comes time for the final coat of paint, everything paints very well and effortlessly. The one side effect though, and I didn't think of this at the time, is that with the shims added in place, the two fastener location holes that we have here on the side may be in the wrong location, and I may have to re-drill them out. No big deal, it's really easily done, but this is something that I am going to have to take care of. The top portion over here, that's not the case. That the dimension on that stayed exactly in the same area, so there's no need for concern on that. Also, one thing I want to mention is that this may or may not come on camera, but I actually numbered the bogie housings for the locations where they're going to get fitted in place, and I have corresponding numbers penciled into the rear portion here of the suspension. This is so that the holes line up appropriately, even though these are all technically in the right spot. Sometimes the bit may meander slightly here or there. Nothing to cause concern. However, if you're marking out the locations and drilling them out, if the holes are slightly off, this may add a little bit of complication to the installation of the parts. Not so if you actually number each of them for their own unit. Also going into prime are the lower hull rigidity sections that I mentioned in the previous video. Once the bogies are fit in place, these are going to be added, thus completing the lower hull detailing on this build. Before I did anything though, because these are FDM and they are filament print, they did have some print lines on them, so I went ahead and polished them down with some super glue and some wet sanding. As you can see, these are now much more refined compared to the way they were originally. Same is also true for the two little segmented ones on the rear. So all these components here are going to be primed first. After the primer is done, they're going to get glued in place, or I should say I'm talking specifically on the rigidity strips. After the suspension's fitted, these guys get mounted in place, and then I can then paint the lower hull, thus blending everything in. And here's the model with the suspension fitted in place, those other parts fitted in place, and on top of that, for good measure, the entire model's lower hull was recoated with another top coat of the base. I just brought it in from outside, so the paint is still a bit shiny in certain areas. It's still drying, but needless to say, it looks very, very handsome at this point here, and it always looks best when everything's a solid color, and you can really see how the model's coming along very nicely. I'll start here with the final drives. I just love the way those ribs came out with the paint. Definitely looks the part. I'm looking really forward to completing the center hub and the sprocket, but more on that to come. And here we have the VVSS. Also, we have those fasteners that I mentioned in the previous video. And I mentioned how they all get fitted on in place. And note how close the first bogie housing is to the mounting fasteners, again taken directly from the real one. For these fasteners that you see here, the majority of them are just dummies and for looks, because trying to get into these recesses here with long fasteners is basically impossible. So I just went ahead and used very short bolts and I glued them in place. There are fasteners in addition to adhesives that are holding the bogies on, namely the 4 that we have right here on the top portion. Those are real fasteners that are securing the piece to the tank. And on the side here we have that lowest most fastener right there, and there's another one on the opposite side, and those two are securing the bogie housing in place. This is more than enough strength required to keep these things where they need to be. Also, not everything is one color. You really get to appreciate the geometry of the H-frame that I was referencing before. How it has those subtle bends to it, as well as the cast numbers and letters that I was also referencing before. Nothing was done, by the way, pre-prep-wise to the FDM prints. I just simply painted them, which is quite astounding because generally FDM prints have that stigma where you need to polish them up, and in certain cases they could use a little helping hand. These ones here, I don't know, they're just magical. Don't ask me what material it is, I couldn't tell you. I have no idea. I just contacted my buddy of mine who has a 3D printer, and he's a whiz at this stuff, and what you see is the end result of that. You get to see those fasteners on the wrench slits. Hopefully that comes out in focus. And even the ones without the wrench slits also came out very nicely. I did test the tank, by the way, by placing it on the ground, and the suspension held up. It supports the weight of the tank and does have a bounce to it. If you depress on the top or press on the top of the tank, it does bounce. So that's exactly what you're looking for. This I'm going to do in more illustration in the next video when I have all the row wheels on in place. Sadly, I can't put all the row wheels on because I did a miscount and I only have enough for one side. So that is something that's going to have to be postponed for the next video update. But needless to say, it is working according to plan. I love the bottom portions here. They just look so dead to rights to the real one. It really is uncanny. It truly is amazing what you can do with 3D printing. And on that note, this is what I mean before. You got to use the material that's best for certain applications. The housing is the old school resin one, and you get to see just why replacing it with a all 3D print one is just not necessary, as the resin one does the job just fine, and also has that added benefit of the cast texturing that's natural with casting as opposed to trying to do it the other way. But the two definitely complement each other very well. And you're playing to both of their strengths. We also have the little jog auxiliary generator on this side here. Again, a topic for an earlier video. I do have the files, by the way, and some of the prints on hand for the rear idler, but I have some other parts that are currently in production for that. That's also going to be the topic of the next video when those parts eventually do come in. Moving our way to the top section, you can see the top details also in better light. We have here the drainage plugs, the escape hatch, but most importantly, we also have the rigidity brace, along with the segmented one on the rear, and you really see just how much added detailing it gives the lower portion of the hull. And by the time this video makes its debut, these components here, as well as the other sets, are all going to be added to the ECA catalog, which is something that I hinted in the previous videos, but now that everything is good and go and squared away, I believe they're ready for prime time. Also on these pieces here, they did receive a little bit of refinement with some wet sanding, and as you can see, they look fantastic. I love the end sections, how it has that hollow corner, or that faux hollow corner, again, just like the real units that I was using as reference. And even though this is not really going to be seen once the model is placed right side up, at least it looks good to have it in this position right here, and it doesn't hurt to have underhull detailing on your builds. And of course, the majority of the detailing is right here on the back end. This section here is effectively completed. There is the flip grill, and this is something that is also hopefully going to be the topic of the next video. And more information on that is, of course, to come. And the transmission cover, that nice chunky jumbo transmission cover, it definitely looks fantastic in all olive drab, if I didn't say so myself. Obviously, the assembly and mounting of these components here mark a huge step forward for this particular build, and really there's not much that needs to be done to the lower hull after this point here. After the events in the next video, that should basically wrap up the entire lower hull section, and then from that point onward, we'll be on the upper hull and then eventually the turret. So this is a huge turning point, and the model's getting very close to the 50% mark, but again, all that information is going to be posted in future upcoming videos. But it's very exciting to have the model right now in this point here, and as you can see, it's definitely one that's looking very well. If the remainder of the build turns out as good as I think it's going to turn out in my head, oh, this is definitely going to be a real cool one to have in the collection. But of course, pump my brakes, more information on that is to come. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale M4A3E2 Jumbo Sherman tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a fantastic way of keeping up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs that have been posted from this build since the project start, as well as photographs from the other 1/6 and smaller scale builds that have been seen on the channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.